In 1971, David Geffen started a record label called Asylum Records. It would become one of the most important labels in American music history, the home of the Eagles, Joni Mitchell, Tom Waits, Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt. But the very first artist he signed was not any of those people. The very first artist on Asylum Records was a 27-year-old woman named Judee Sill, who had spent part of her childhood on the streets, who had been arrested for armed robbery, who had done time in reform school and county jail, and who had kicked a heroin addiction before she walked into Geffen's office with a guitar and a stack of songs that sounded like nothing he had ever heard. Graham Nash, of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, was the one who brought her in. He had heard her play at a small folk club in Los Angeles, and he had gone home afterwards unable to stop thinking about what she had done with a melody. He told Geffen he had found someone. Geffen listened to the demo tape. He signed her before the tape was finished. This is the part that matters. David Geffen, a man whose entire career was built on recognizing talent before anyone else, heard Judee Sill and decided she was the one. Not second, not 10th, first. The very first release on the label that would define the California sound of the 1970s was Judee Sill's self-titled debut album, Nobody Bought It. But before we get to that, before we get to the part where nobody bought it and nobody remembered her and the label moved on, we need to understand where this voice came from. Because the voice did not come from nowhere. The voice came from a very specific kind of American damage. Judee Sill was born in Oakland, California in 1944. Her father was a bar owner who imported animals for film sets, a strange, specific occupation that meant the family home sometimes had monkeys and exotic birds in the backyard. He died when Judee was young. Her mother remarried. The stepfather was an alcoholic. The household became a place where nobody was safe. By her teens, Judee was on the streets. She shoplifted. She forged checks. She was arrested for armed robbery at a gas station. She was sent to reform school. She started using heroin. She was arrested again, and this time she was sent to county jail. She was not yet 20 years old. In jail, something happened. She started writing music, not the kind of folk music that the other California singer-songwriters were writing at the time. Not the sun-drenched, gentle canyon breeze songs of Laurel Canyon. Judee had been studying Bach. She had taught herself the rules of Baroque counterpoint, the mathematical way that 2 or 3 melodies can move at the same time, weaving around each other, each one independent but all of them belonging to the same piece. She took that and poured it into folk songs. The result was music that sounded like a hymn being sung by someone who had done time. The melodies were intricate, precise, architectural. The lyrics were full of religious imagery, crosses, light, redemption, the specific ache of a person looking for God in a world that had given her no reason to believe in one. When she walked out of jail for the last time, clean, with a notebook full of songs and a cheap acoustic guitar, she was 23 years old. She had survived the worst parts of her own story. The music that came next was the proof. The self-titled debut, Judee Sill, came out in September 1971. The cover showed her sitting cross-legged in a plain white blouse with her guitar, looking directly at the camera. No makeup, no pose, just a woman and her instrument and a gaze that did not flinch. The centerpiece of the album was a song called Jesus Was a Crossmaker. It is to this day one of the strangest and most beautiful folk songs ever written. The melody moves in 3 directions at once, a Bach fugue played on an acoustic guitar, with a full orchestral arrangement behind it, building and building until the final chorus, where Judee's voice breaks open into something that sounds like a prayer and a warning at the same time. The crossmaker in the title is a lover who builds crosses for other people to carry. It is a love song and a crucifixion at the same time, the critics noticed. Rolling Stone gave the album a respectful review. Other musicians, particularly other women in the Laurel Canyon scene, talked about her with a kind of awe that was unusual in that competitive world. Joni Mitchell, who was not known for praising her peers, acknowledged the craftsmanship. The public did not notice. The album sold poorly. Asylum promoted it. But Judee was not an easy artist to market. She did not look like the California girls on the magazine covers. She did not have a famous boyfriend. She did not do the things that female singer-songwriters in 1971 were expected to do to sell records. She did not smile on command. She did not flirt with interviewers. She did not soften her lyrics to make them more accessible. She had written a masterpiece. The masterpiece had been released on the most important new label in Los Angeles, and nobody had come. What do you do with a first album that everyone respects and nobody buys? You make another one. In 1973, Judee Sill released her second album, Heart Food. It was more ambitious than the first. The orchestrations were fuller, strings, horns, woodwinds, all arranged by Judee herself in the Bach counterpoint style she had taught herself in jail. The melodies were more complex. The religious imagery was deeper, more layered, more personal. The opening track, There's a Rugged Road, is a song about the long walk from destruction to grace. It builds from a single acoustic guitar into a full orchestral swell that sounds like the end credits of a film about someone who has survived something they should not have survived. The vocal is calm, controlled, precise. Every note is placed with the care of a person who knows exactly what each one costs. Heart Food is now considered one of the great lost albums of the 1970s. At the time, it sold even fewer copies than the debut. Asylum Records had moved on. The Eagles had arrived. Joni Mitchell was recording Court and Spark. Jackson Browne was becoming a star. The label that had started with Judee Sill was now a machine, and the machine had no room for a woman whose songs required patience, silence, and attention. Judee was dropped. Not with a phone call, not with a meeting. She simply stopped hearing from the label. The calls stopped. The letters stopped. The studio time was given to someone else. She found out she had been dropped the way most dropped artists find out, by noticing the silence. She had made 2 albums. Both were ignored. The label that had signed her first had let her go. She was 29 years old, and her recording career was over. After 1973, Judee Sill disappeared from the music industry. She did not disappear cleanly. She struggled. The addiction that she had beaten before her first album came back. She was in pain. She had been in a serious car accident that left her with chronic back injuries, and the painkillers she was prescribed became another dependency. She lived in small apartments in the San Fernando Valley. She was poor. She occasionally played at tiny venues in Los Angeles, bars, coffee houses, living rooms. But she was no longer recording, no longer writing with the intensity she had brought to Heart Food. The people who had known her in the asylum years rarely saw her. She kept a notebook. Friends who visited her in those years said the notebook was always near her. A spiral-bound pad filled with musical notation, lyrics, diagrams of chord progressions. She was still composing. She was still thinking in counterpoint. But the songs stayed in the notebook. There was no label to record them, no studio to walk into, no Graham Nash to call David Geffen on her behalf. The Laurel Canyon scene she had been part of, briefly peripherally, never quite at the center, had moved on without noticing her absence. The Eagles were selling millions. Joni Mitchell was a cultural icon. Tom Waits was building his own mythology on the same label that had dropped Judee 3 years into its existence. She was the first artist on Asylum Records. By the mid-1970s, that fact had become a piece of trivia that nobody remembered. How long does an artist have to be forgotten before the forgetting becomes the story? On November 5th, 1979, Judee Sill was found dead in her apartment in North Hollywood. She was 35 years old. The cause of death was an overdose. She had been struggling with addiction for years, and the struggle had ended the way these struggles sometimes end. Quietly, alone, in a room where nobody was watching. There was no front-page obituary, there was no tribute concert, there was no memorial fund. The woman who had been the first artist signed to one of the most important record labels in American history died in a small apartment in the San Fernando Valley, and the industry she had been part of did not pause. Her 2 albums were out of print within a year of her death. If you had wanted to hear Judee Sill in 1980, you would have needed to find a used copy in a Los Angeles record shop, and even then, you would have been looking for a name that nobody behind the counter recognized. She left behind the notebook. She left behind a small number of home recordings, demos, sketches, songs that had never been finished. She left behind 2 albums that almost nobody had heard. And she left behind a question that would take 30 years to answer. Was it possible that the very first artist on Asylum Records had been the best one? In November 1979, nobody was asking. And then, very slowly, the way it always happens with the artists we tell you about on this channel, something began. In the early 2000s, both of Judee Sill's albums were reissued by small, independent labels. A generation of younger musicians discovered her. Jim O'Rourke, the experimental musician and producer, called Heart Food one of the greatest albums ever made. Fleet Foxes listed her as a primary influence. Wise Blood, Natalie Merring, whose own albums sound like cathedrals, said that Judee Sill was the artist who taught her that folk music and classical composition could be the same thing. Bill Callahan, Andy Kabak of Vetiver, a whole ecosystem of 21st century musicians who write quiet, careful, architecturally precise songs trace their work back to a woman who learned Bach counterpoint in a California jail and died at 35 in a San Fernando Valley apartment. The first artist on Asylum Records was the one nobody remembered, and the albums that Asylum let go out of print turned out to be the ones that mattered most. Not to the millions, but to the small, specific, essential audience that needed to hear exactly that voice on exactly that kind of night. Judee Sill made 2 albums. They were ignored, they were dropped, they were forgotten, and then they were found. If you have never heard Jesus Was a Crossmaker, tonight is the night. Subscribe. We do this every day.